Welcome, everyone. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter, and I'm an associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. And I'm also the coordinator of the online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. Welcome to the online Peace Science Colloquium, where we present ongoing new research on conflict and peace science by scholars in all over the world. So we try to present working papers and new projects so that we can get a sense of what's going on in the field and try to collectively improve these projects. Today we welcome Christopher Chiego, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's going to present on how wartime experiences affect beliefs about military power. We're joined by an esteemed panel of discussants today. We have Professor Jeff Carter, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. We have Laia Balcells, who is an associate professor of political science in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. And we're also going to be joined by Dan Reiter, who is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Political Science at Emory University, though we're having a bit of technical difficulty. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who will give us a short presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Whoa.
Whoa.
All right, here we go. Can you all see it?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate your comments. This is basically a chapter of my dissertation that I hope to also turn into sort of a standalone paper. So I welcome comments on all aspects of it, but particularly how it could help stand alone, perhaps separately from a broader project. So in this paper, I'm trying to combine two separate strands of work here. The first is sort of the bargaining models of war and how those can apply to war recurrence. There's been much study and literature on how participants learn from fighting during wars, and that can help lead to war-ending agreements. But there's been less work out there about how what's learned during a war persists afterwards and then affects the likelihood of the war recurring. There's also been a sort of separate literature, more, I guess, comparative politics in some cases, about the effect of political violence on individuals and how that affects their later beliefs and behavior. There's been all kinds of studies on this. They found kind of a mixed range of effects, some positive effects, some negative effects. But what hasn't really been done yet, I think, is focus on how to combine these two. And I think that we can show an interesting set of insights here from looking at the way that the effect of political violence during a war affects these beliefs that can also then affect the likelihood of a war recurring here. So in sort of an overview of my presentation, I'm first going to talk about the argument here that more direct experiences during a war are likely to cause greater updating about relative military strength compared to less direct experiences. I'll use some data here from the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, some surveys of nationally representative respondents before and afterwards. And the independent variable here will be these direct experiences with the invasion, whether or not the survey respondent was within an area that was invaded. And then the DV here will be various measures of beliefs about relative military strength. And I'll talk more about where those come from the survey results later on. So the general preview of the finding here is that respondents in invaded regions of Georgia were significantly more likely than respondents in the non-invaded regions to have more pessimistic beliefs on Georgia's military strength against Russia afterwards. So I'm focusing here primarily on civilians within Georgia for this part of the project. So why should beliefs about relative military power matter in the first place? Well, they're really important, as other scholars have shown in the rationalist models of war, that this can help explain why wars begin and why they end over time. And beliefs here about the relative power I'm using include both the likelihood of winning and the costs of fighting the war as well, too. So both of those are kind of combined here in how I'm defining relative power. But many studies have also shown that updating beliefs accurately during a war can be quite difficult. There's all kinds of things that take place during a war that make it harder for individuals, even leaders and military commanders, to learn from the war. So there's sort of a fog of war effect.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Great, hi, welcome.
Really technical delay, and we fixed it, whatever it was. And I know we're a little bit behind, so Chris, I'm Donnie Reiter. Nice to meet you. I guess let's just get rolling, if that's okay with everybody else.
Yeah, for sure.
We already
Chris
started a little bit, so I'm in media res right here. So I'm talking here about, well, relative military power matters. In the first place, I cite Dan Reiter at the top of the slide here. And we're talking about why beliefs, updating them accurately can be difficult. So I first pointed out there's sort of a fog of war during war that makes accurately obtaining information hard. But I think there's also some work about an optimism bias too, that basically you expect your side to do well during a war, and you will have a harder time updating negative information and accepting negative information during a war if it doesn't make your side look good or yourself feel good. And this also matters because in democracies, at least, civilian beliefs about relative military power may matter in particular here. Political leaders will pay attention to what the civilians believe and what they desire, and the civilians can also exercise their right to vote and perhaps throw out leaders who do things that they don't like in this case. So overall, relative military power here and what people believe about them are important for not only war beginning and ending, but also for the leaders in countries to think about when they're making those decisions. So I think one of the ways that beliefs can change through experience here is how individuals directly or indirectly experience the war. So I kind of divide this into two sets of experiences, direct and indirect. The first here is direct experience. You actually see or experience the war in person. You see enemy troops advancing or occupying certain areas. You might see battles or other enemy troops fleeing, attacking, or your side troops fleeing. In contrast, there's indirect experiences where you don't actually are physically within proximity of the area. You hear about the war from another source in this case. So news, rumors, or other sources of information here. And my general argument here is that these direct experiences are more likely to lead to updating about relative strength than indirect experiences, simply because you directly see it, it provides images, provides all kinds of sensory and emotional effects and impacts on it that you don't necessarily experience by only hearing about it through indirect experiences. So just as an example of what I mean here by direct and indirect experiences, here's the example of Berlin, Germany in World War I and World War II after the wars both end. On the left here, you see an actual celebratory parade after the war ends with German politicians and leaders welcoming the troops home. And then you see a nearby location in 1945 that is completely devastated and destroyed. So the direct experiences in this case for the German people in Berlin, on the right-hand side, you see what they may have suffered in that case, while on the left-hand side, they only felt the war indirectly in this case. I'm going to use now a case on the 2008 Russo-Georgian War here for the remainder of the paper and how I'm going to study it. The swords, as a kind of brief review, was fought between the Caucasus country of Georgia and the country of Russia in August 2008. It was a short war, but it was relatively high intensity. There were about 1,000 battle deaths between both civilians and combatants, and about 57,000 people engaged, about 40,000 Russians and about 17,000 Georgians. So it was a pretty large-scale conflict here. It's also, I think, an important case because there's similar wars that are possible in the near future. We may be seeing this again, maybe a repeat of the war against Russia and Georgia, or with other countries in the Caucasus, or the Baltics, and most recently, I think, Ukraine and Russia are having a similar dynamic going on. And also, I think it's an important case for this theory I'm trying to test is that it's a democracy at the time of the war. Still kind of developing democracy, but had free, relatively fair elections going up to the time of the war in 2008. So Georgian civilians knew they could vote, they knew they could exercise influence at the ballot box, and their leaders also knew this as well. I also think it's somewhat of a hard case to maybe see the effects here. Because it was a relatively limited war and only affected a very small part of Georgia here, if we do see any effects of the invasion, then I think that could lead to greater confidence that there is an effect going on here in this case. Just to give you a brief sort of geographic overview of what we're dealing with here. This is the country of Georgia, the official boundaries here, divided into these different regions. That's kind of like their equivalent of states. The red here will show the regions that were invaded during the war. The one on the left is Samagrello, the one on the right is Chita Kartli, and then the ones in white were not invaded. It's also important to point out that there are two parts of Georgia that were not controlled by the Georgian government and are not part of the data set here. That's South Ossetia in blue and Abkhazia in orange. Those were both sort of where the Russians based their troops and launched their attacks from. So I'm interested here in comparing the effects then of the invasion on those two regions that are in red and comparing that to the other regions that were not directly affected by the war that are in white. So the research design here, I'm using individual level responses from two nationally representative surveys, one from March 2008 and one from after the war in October 2008. So the war was in August, and we have this kind of cool case here where there's nationally representative surveys both before and after the war. Now, these are not the same respondents or the exact same questions. They are the same geographic areas, though. So what I'm trying to do in my research design is to try to figure out, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, about how best to make sure we can deal with the lack of the same respondents and the lack of the exact same questions. So the independent variable here, again, is these invaded regions, the 2 out of the 11 regions that were invaded. It's also important to note that not all respondents in those regions may have directly experienced the invasion. There may have been people in valleys or in mountaintops that were not in the path of the Russian invasion during the war. So we are lumping into there some people who may not have actually experienced the treatment. The good news, though, is that, again, that sort of biases against finding a result. So if we do find an effect, that hopefully leads to a bit more confidence that there is something going on there. The surveys did not ask people if they actually directly experienced the war. And then the dependent variable here is measures of beliefs about relative military power. And I'll talk in a minute about specifically what survey items I'm looking for those. What I want to do first is check for balance between the invaded and non-invaded regions before the war began, to make sure that they're similar in their political beliefs, especially those relating to military power and attitudes towards Russia. So sort of a pre-war balance check between them. I will use 2 survey questions. The first about whether or not a war was likely to begin between Russia and Georgia in the next 2 years. And then how important it was to increase the military budget within Georgia. Again, these are all measures of civilians within Georgia. I also looked at these questions both directly and using a variety of controls to try to make sure for differences across different respondents and across different areas. And there were no significant differences in responses to these questions between these respondents in the soon-to-be invaded regions and the soon-to-non-be-invaded regions. So before the war began, there was not major difference on at least those 2 major survey questions here. So they both thought similarly about the likelihood of a war to begin and how important it was to increase the military budget. So the main test uses this survey question, and it's kind of a complicated question, so I wanted to make sure that you could see it directly reproduced here. Basically, this is going to come from the survey after the war, and it asks respondents whether or not they agree more with statement 1 or statement 2. I like this question here because it kind of gets into the trade-off. It's not whether or not you want to fight back against Russia or you want revenge against Russia after the war, which the Georgians lost really badly, but whether or not they thought it was worth to keep spending money on the army and potentially resist the Russian invasion in the future, or if they just want to give up. And so statement 2, sort of wanting to give up, I sort of view as the ideal of being more greater affected by the war and choosing to believe that it's not worth fighting or attempting to resist afterwards. So this leads to my hypothesis here, is that respondents in the invaded regions should be more likely than respondents in the non-invaded regions to prefer to redirect expenditures from the army rather than challenge the Russians militarily. Again, going back to the kind of the theory here, that people directly affected by the invasion are more likely to update their beliefs in a negative direction here, and so they don't even want to try to defend the country in the future. They view the Georgians as so weak compared to the Russians that it's not worth trying to defend. So I'm going to show you the results for a regression analysis using ordinary least squares here. I also checked this in ordinal logit as well, because the dependent variable, as you can see here, is a sort of, I recoded this from 1, 2, 3, and 4, a 4 sort of category scale. But I just want to preview the way the results are going to be displayed. The higher coefficients on these the variables here will suggest support for less spending. That is, a higher coefficient says you don't want to spend more money, you just kind of want to give up and redirect money somewhere else. The key variable here is the invaded region. This is basically a dummy variable where the respondent being in the invaded region, and then the dependent variable here is the 4-point scale of the survey question. I'll show you results from two models here, one with fewer controls in dark gray and the other with more controls, which is in light gray. So you'll see a lot of variables on the screen, but dark gray one is just the results of this model with fewer controls, and light gray was one with more controls. These are all 95% confidence intervals around various point estimates, again, in OLS, but these results are similar if you use ordered logit. So here's the main results from this effect here. Again, the light gray one is from a model with fewer controls, with more controls, and the dark gray one is from a model with fewer controls here. And you can see there's a significant effect here of the invaded region dummy variable here. Those in the invaded regions are less likely to want to spend more on the army. There's more support for them lowering the spending on the army in response to that question there. Which, again, could seem a little puzzling at first, because why wouldn't people in the border regions want to have more a stronger defense in this case? But in this case, going along with my theory and sort of supporting my hypothesis, the people in the invaded regions are less likely to want to spend more on the army. And there's various other controls we can talk about later in the Q&A if you'd like, included in there. I also did a number of robustness checks here too. I first looked at an alternate measure of the dependent variable here, which used a sort of similar question about whether or not people would support a presidential candidate who offered to give up the disputed regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in exchange for security guarantees against Russia. And you see actually people in the invaded regions are significantly more likely to support giving up the disputed regions in exchange for the security guarantees from external support in that case, compared to those in the non-invaded regions. And I think that that's a case where you see the effect that was intended. I also
2 minutes, Chris.
Understood. I also looked at alternative measures of support for Saakashvili, who was the Georgian president at the time, whether they wanted to vote for him, supported him, or his party. There were similar results. I also excluded the capital region of Tbilisi and respondents from there, because that's a very urban region with a higher income than the rest of the country. Similar results. And I also checked another foreign policy question here to make sure this is not just capturing a foreign policy shift. This was about whether or not the respondents wanted more of an orientation towards Russia or Europe. And there are actually, in this case, no significant differences between the invaded and non-invaded regions. So I think that the DVs I'm using here are picking up more about this relative military strength aspect rather than just a general foreign policy orientation. And the last thing is I also included airstrikes as a direct experience in the independent variable. There were several other regions of Georgia that experienced airstrikes but no ground invasion. And there wasn't much of a difference, including those at that point as well. So the final thing I'll conclude with is, did this have an effect on the political aspects? Did people in the invaded regions perhaps respond at the ballot box? Well, the problem is the main presidential election in Georgia took place 5 years after the war ended. There was one just before the war and then one 5 years later after a lot of other events like the Great Recession happened. So it's not necessarily measuring directly what happened during the war. Also, Saakashvili himself was terminated out, so he wasn't on the ballot again, the Georgian president. But you do see overall there's a 36-point decline in support for Saakashvili's party across all of Georgia. But in the invaded regions, it's 42 points. So those people there particularly seem to disapprove of the party, at least, that led them into the war. So in conclusion, I think that as a result here, we're seeing that civilians might be more likely to update their beliefs about relative military power as a result of these direct experiences compared to indirect ones. And this has a lot of implications, I think, here for tactical, strategic areas, including strategies in counterinsurgency, perhaps the coin strategy and the importance of just having people present on the ground, wartime occupation procedures, and also troop levels and war plans. You may want more troops involved to help, again, have more direct displays of power in this case. And that's all I have. And I welcome your comments, any and all of them.
Great, thank you, Chris. And with that, let's open it up to whoever wants to go first.
I can go first.
Go for it.
Okay, so Chris, thanks for sending this paper along, or I guess dissertation chapter. It was super interesting. Obviously, we don't have the rest of the dissertation, but I saw the one footnote which kind of very briefly describes what else you're doing, so I kind of have a sense. So, okay, moving forward, I think that the paper needs to better develop two major areas of theory. Okay, major area of theory number one is you have to think about what is the foreign policy choice the state is making in reaction to this massive external threat. And, you know, basically there's, and this is old IR theory back to the 80s and 90s. It's basically like 3 or so things you can do. One is you can rearm, one is you can find an ally, one is you can basically just, you know, give up and allow yourself to not threaten the other side. Okay. And so there's a lot of literature which tries to understand why these states would make different choices, and there's a lot of different countries which have faced this and made different choices. So the first thing you need to do is familiarize yourself with all of that literature, because they're all basically talking about the same thing that you're talking about. One of the closest examples to the Georgia experience is Finland after World War II, right? So Finland fights 2 wars against the Soviets, they get beaten both times, and they basically accede to Soviet domination, right? And that's in part because NATO doesn't want to include them. Conversely, sometimes a country gets overwhelmed and faces threats, but doesn't have to give in because there's an external alliance, which is an option, right? Like all states in Europe, you know, during after World War II and after World War I. Okay, I wrote an entire book about this, and also looked at the learning part. You might want to take a look at it. It's called Crucible of Beliefs. My dissertation. And I'll send you some notes, these particulars when we're done. Okay, so the first thing that you really need to do is to just frame like the foreign policy theory part, or it's not even a theory, it's like pre-theory in the sense of like, what are the decisions that the state has to make or that the individual has to make? All right, so that's kind of big theory area number one. Big theory area number two is you have to have a much, much larger section on the massive literature on learning. I wrote an entire book on this, and there's not only a lot of literature on this in the IR literature, there's a ton of literature on this in the cognitive and social sector. There's also a ton of literature on this in terms of the effects of wartime experience. I mean, some of what you cite here, and you kind of, I mean, you're citing it, which is great, but you really have to like work through the theory of it, because there's a lot of different ideas about how, you know, these effects might happen. You know, for example, you're talking about indirect versus direct. There's a gigantic social and cognitive psych literature about that. So they talk about salience, for example. You have an experience, there's a whole bunch of experimental literature which says what happens if you expose subjects to salient versus not salient information. Salient might be you see a video, and non-salient you read some text. Okay, so I mean, you know, I wrote a book about it in '96. That was 20-some years ago. There's been a huge amount of work since then. There's also been a bunch of IR work. I mean, one of my favorite IR books on this is by a guy named Dien Phuong Kong, who's trying to understand why the Johnson administration escalated the Vietnam War in 1965. He found that all of the people in Johnson's White House, basically whatever their personal experience was, caused them, that affected what recommendation they made, right? And so that's also like direct. So I think that would, if you want this to be a standalone paper, I think those are probably, for me, the two first priorities, is like taking a bunch of time and reading these relatively large sets of existing literature, and then figuring out, you know, how you want to frame and situate your paper. So those are kind of my main comments. And I don't know if Emily, what we pass it to Chris, or we have more comments from the panelists, or
we usually have Chris respond, but Jeff has a quick 2-finger on your point before Chris responds.
Yeah,
and then we'll kind of go back and forth.
On Donnie's first point, the kind of big theory picture, I think, it's kind of tapping into the foreign policy substitutability literature would be really helpful. And I found myself thinking about that in particular with the results for the second question from survey 2, because it's not as straightforward as just reducing military spending, right? It's kind of talking about if you reduce military spending and relinquish claims, then you get to tap into NATO. And that's a lot more complicated than just saying, well, there's a change in the beliefs about relative capabilities, so we're going to have to do X.
Chris.
Yeah, this is great. So yes, I do have more learning in my theory chapter. So I'm clearly going to have to import some of that and add more of that there. But I really appreciate the foreign policy kind of substitutability discussion. I need to look back at that more, I think. But that's a really good example. And yeah, thanks for those suggestions on that.
Jeff or Laia? Laia. Oh, you're muted. You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So also on the theory side, I would like to see more in the paper about why does it matter what the public thinks, right? I mean, why do we have to think? Why do we have to care about what these individuals think? I mean, right? I mean, do they have an impact in actual foreign policy and the decisions that they're going to be made, right? So I think that there should be more about how these change in attitudes could have an impact on actual foreign policy, right? And if that's the goal of your chapter, right? I mean, I kind of read your paper as a contribution to the literature on the effects of conflict at the individual level, right? Like with some of the literature that you cite, and so, but I think that you have like two streams of literature here, like the kind of more like the foreign policy literature, and then this kind of like micro level literature on the effects at the individual level. And I would like you to work a little bit more on the connection between these two levels. And so I guess, I mean, the follow-up of on this, I mean, because I guess that was just more of a comment, is that I would like to see more about whether this is just like the direct experience of the conflict itself, or there are other things that could be having an impact on how these people are seeing the conflict after it's over, right? And so are there like maybe propaganda? Are these people like reading the same newspapers that the rest of the country are they watching different TVs or radio? I mean, what else can be going on in addition to the actual experience of the conflict, right? Mm-hmm. So these are just like, I have more comments and questions, but we can just like, I can stop here and then we can follow up.
Okay, great. Chris, do you have a response?
Yeah, this is great. I think that I was trying to build on with the electoral connection later on, the last kind of part of the paper, that maybe there was an effect, even controlling for other aspects of the on the election in 2013. The problem is, again, there was a recession in between. 5 years is a fairly long time for a 5-day war to have these effects still. So I'm just trying to work on teasing that out. But I think theoretically I can do a bit more on this about whether or not leaders care about what the public thinks. Do they know what the public thinks in this case? And even add some qualitative evidence from the very very talkative Georgian sources sometimes, who like to talk about their things to Western leaders and such, and how they approach this. There's a lot of foreign diplomats who are in government there. And I think I could definitely use that qualitatively to help unpack and say, yes, this does matter here. The leaders do pay attention. The stakes here do matter for affecting how the country might conduct foreign policy in the future.
Great.
All right. I want to kind of echo a point that's been made a couple times. I think this sounds like a really interesting project in the dissertation, like the idea of kind of developing this idea of military decisiveness. I think that can be a really nice contribution. But if you move forward with this as a kind of standalone paper, I think that you might kind of run into some problems, because I think that if this is a chapter in a dissertation, right, that you can you can build on the previous chapters in a way to kind of connect the big picture ideas to this kind of specific test on learning, but you're not going to have the space to do that in a standalone article. And at least kind of when I was reading the paper, I felt like there was a pretty big disconnect between how you frame the chapter and the argument and the empirical analyses, and especially maybe on the kind of questions from the first survey. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the question about the likelihood of war occurring is being connected to military capabilities. Because to kind of, you frame this as a test of learning, but then that, I don't see a question about, do you think war is likely to occur is inherently about the balance of power?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'm somewhat limited by what they chose to include in these surveys, so I'm looking as hard as I can for questions that were based around potential wars in the future. I agree that that's not the best direct test of learning during the war, but I think that if you believe war is maybe more or less likely before war begins, then that could affect perhaps how you view the war. So if you think that war is likely and it happens anyways, then you might have a different experience during the war compared to if the war kind of came out of the blue and no one was expecting it to happen in those cases there. So I think there's a little bit of a difference there, but you're right. It's not a direct test of what the Georgians thought about their relative power compared to Russia before the war and after the war in that case. So I'm using the things I have there. I'd love to hear other suggestions too about if other people have ideas for what things I could try to look at again to try to get that before the war, the invaded and non-invaded regions were just not that different on these key aspects of foreign policy orientation and beliefs about potential war in the future, though. But that's a very good question, and the concern is very well appreciated.
Laia.
Yeah, I had the same concern about like having two different set of questions in the surveys, and I know you're limited by what they are asking, and I don't know what questions there are in the survey, so I cannot really say which ones you should choose. But going back to the electoral results that you have at the end, which I find really interesting, I mean, the one thing that you could try to do is check whether electoral support or support for the incumbent government or like these kind of questions that I'm sure they're being asked in both surveys are different, right? In these two surveys. So try to, I mean, I'm wondering like if their support for the government decreases in these regions. And I mean, and these, I mean, I'm sure you have a way to measure this, because I mean, usually these surveys ask about electoral support and things like that, and voting and these kind of things.
There's sort of an interesting effect though in these regions. There's a lot of affective. There's some of the questions on the survey do sort of get at, do you like the country? Do you support the president and such like that? And the president has very high support sort of immediately after the war in this case. It does decay a lot afterwards in later surveys from later years, but it's almost interesting that there's sort of a rally effect going on there, or a very kind of nationalism, patriotic effect after the war in those cases. So it's a little interesting. I'm trying to just be able to distinguish between this sort of rally around the war effect or rally around the leader flag effect, but also this idea, do you want then to do things like increasing military spending and trying to compete with the Russian government in the future, which could potentially lead to these kind of border disputes that flare up into a war again. And I think there might be some interesting distinctions there I could get into to try to show you may support your country and support your military very strongly, but you don't necessarily want them to start, getting more military forces and blundering around in the border regions.
I want to,
yeah, Danny.
Like, it's a separate issue, unless people want to weigh in on this other question.
No, go ahead.
So I'm going to kind of talk about learning theory a little bit, which kind of builds an earlier point. Okay. The really easy thing to do if you're talking about learning is to just show that people learn from the past. That's the real easy part, or easy to persuade people that's going on. The really hard thing to do is to predict ex post how they should learn. What lessons they really learn. There's lots of examples of a single experience causing people to draw diverging draw diverging lessons, like, you know, liberals and conservatives draw different lessons from Vietnam, for example. Okay. And so that's one thing, that's one area of theory that I think we need to, you know, think about, which is exactly, you know, why is it that you would predict this specific lesson if you have this, you know, direct experience of conflict. And let me kind of come at it a slightly different way. I don't think like balance of power is really like the right way to go here as a big theoretical hook, because there's no way anybody would actually think that Russia and Georgia are anywhere close to having the same balance of power. Now, like France and Prussia in 1870, right? I mean, they're even. I mean, I have a case study in that. You know more about this than I do, but afterwards, France could conclude, oh, we actually could win the next war with Prussia, right? But here, like, that's just not a reasonable inference on Georgia's part.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
The interesting question is not like, why did people in invaded regions conclude that they could not defeat regions? The question is, what lesson did the people in the non-invaded regions learn? Okay, and so one way you can lay this out is to say, you know, can we basically inflict enough costs on this much larger country such that they're not going to bother investing enough resources to win given their stance, right? And one analogy I thought about was the Vietnam-Cambodia wars of the late 70s and early 80s. Where there, clearly, you know, Vietnam is much smaller than China, like Georgia is much smaller than Russia, right? But the key question to them is, you know, can they be enough of a thorn in the side of China or slow China down enough such that it's not worth it for China to use their massive military power for the sake of this, you know, relatively small territorial conflict? And so my guess is, you know, in the Georgian case, in the non-invaded regions, what people are updating on is that question, not the pure, you know, balance of power, but it's more like, you know, can be enough of a thorn in the side of the Russians going forward such that there is a positive marginal return for more military spending? So anyway.
Well, that's a great point. I've tried to think of ways to word it like that. You know, the ability to inflict damage on the Russians to dissuade them. Again, the way the Finns did that during the Winter War, and also the Vietnamese against the Chinese in those conflicts too. So I'm just trying to think, is there a better way to phrase this? Is there a current concept out there already to kind of get at the idea? Rather than saying balance of power, which I try to, you know, as you pointed out, has other connotations too. So what might be a better way? I'd love to hear feedback on just ways to frame this as the kind of concept we're trying to measure here that people might update about then.
Well, I mean, a way to frame it is, I mean, the real question that you're asking of military spending is, what's the marginal return on more military spending? Okay, because if you believe that there's a positive marginal return in terms of security, then you support more military spending. And if you believe there's basically no marginal return, then you support cutting military spending, right? That's the key. That's the key from an economist's point of view. That's the key difference between the lessons in the two regions, invaded and not invaded. Okay, and so then the question is, okay, you know, why is it that more military spending might then translate into some kind of benefit, and then it's just taking advantage of terrain and so forth? I mean, the problem is that the bargaining, you're drawing on the bargaining model of war literature, but that has very, very simplistic ideas about how warfare actually works. I mean, it assumes that you basically just got counts of sizes of militaries. There's uncertainty about size. That makes war more likely. And that's really not what's going on here, because everybody knows that Russia's much larger than Georgia. So it's not like a bean counting type of problem. It's more like, do we have the ability, you know, such that more spending can make us not for the Georgia? So I think that might, you know, I think that I understand why you want to hang on the bargaining model of war framing, because it's so, you know, ubiquitous, but I think it's not necessarily the best match for what's going on here. It's specific, you know, temporal context.
Jeff, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will say that if you do want kind of a concept though to kind of hang the story on that kind of touches on kind of what you want to do, but also Donnie's point, right, it's Schelling's the power to hurt, right? It's the idea that, you know, can you kind of stick it out versus inflicting these kind of marginal cost on the enemy, right? So, you know, Bronislaw Slonchev, you know, has a paper entitled "The Power to Hurt," but then also there's an he's got an APSR about kind of the convergence in beliefs around that. And so I do think that there are things that you can do, that you can draw. There are concepts you can draw on that could be useful.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in, there's also a literature on asymmetric deterrence by T.V. Paul. His question is, how is it that small countries are sometimes able to deter large countries, right? Which with Jeff's point, that sometimes you're deterring not because you're going to win some toe-to-toe, all-out set-piece attrition battle between banks, but because you can, whatever, selectively impose costs and just make it not worth their while. And that clearly, I mean, for military spending in Georgia to make any rational sense to deter Russia, that would be the logic.
Yeah, that's great. The asymmetric deterrence literature, I've looked a little bit at that, but I think that in this case specifically, if I'm doing this for a separate standalone paper, that makes a lot of sense. And so the power to hurt, I mean, seems like it is concepts in the bargaining sort of model to some extent, but it's not the same thing as, I guess, the way people traditionally look at it in terms of the ability to win a war or the likelihood of winning a war if you fought it to the end, for instance. Instead, you're looking here at the costs then of resistance for a very specific scenario, a very specific case here. And ideally, I'd like to look then in this project at how the experience of a war and actually going through that, learning about what the costs might be like you have to pay yourself, but also how strong you could inflict those costs on the other side. The Russians did take some casualties. The Georgians were good at artillery and some good anti-aircraft attacks too. But yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe I'll keep on going in that direction afterwards.
Hi, you want to go next? Oh wait, you're muted again.
I may just change gears a little bit. I kind of want to talk a little bit about the empirics. So I mean, I really like the paper, and I think, I mean, you're doing what you can with the kind of data that you have. But I kind of was wondering if it would be better to go at the lower level of analysis, because I feel that this regional level is not really capturing very well what you're getting at. So, for instance, you're considering that everyone living in these regions is experiencing the conflict directly, right? And your definition of direct experience is very narrow, and it kind of implies that you have like some kind of like direct contact with the enemy, or you've witnessed like fighting and these kind of things. And I could imagine that there are people living in these regions, as you were saying, that they live in valleys, or they live in areas where they just don't have this kind of direct experience, right? So I think that to be more precise, it would be better to go at like the municipal level, or like the village level, or like, and I know that, you know, it's hard to get the kind of data that I'm asking you to get, but it's just like, because I mean, I think that this would allow you to have like a precise measure of violence during the conflict, or fighting during the conflict, and know exactly who are the people who are being experiencing this conflict directly. Now, this would imply that you would have access to the zip codes or the locality, of the respondents. Okay, right, yeah. So that's problem. Yeah, I mean, then I don't know if you're going to be able to, because I mean that's something I would expect you to be able to do, just like geolocate the respondents. Okay, then another thing is that you show us a sort of covariate balance table, but you don't do a very good job presenting the covariate balance, and just like would like to see whether these variables are significantly different. And so I would so that's like for table let's see, table table 1. Instead of having, I wouldn't organize it this way, where I would have like one column of like, right, of the the conflict regions and the non-conflict regions, and then show me that there is covariate balance between these regions. And I would like you to show me that there is covariate balance in presidential approval. I know that you told me that presidential approval goes up after the conflict in these regions, but it looks like that it's a very significant variable to explain your first hypothesis, right? The first the attitude towards whether there's going to be a conflict or not, and also I think that there's lowering spending is also very much correlated with presidential support. So I think that showing that there is covariate balance is important to be able for me to believe that the results are driven by this experience of the war and not by something else like presidential support. And then I mean I kind of have the impression that a lot of the results are driven by this region Shida Kartli, right, which is the region under South Ossetia.
Yes.
And right, so why is that the case? And so why the experience of the war in the other regions doesn't have any impact, or doesn't seem to be having any impact, right? So yeah, these are some questions for you on the empirics.
Yeah, let me respond to all three. They're great points here. So yeah, I don't have the data at the local super locality level yet. I've asked the source of the data about this several times. I have not gotten a response about that local level. I think again they're concerned about potential issues of data data getting out in that case. There is one way in which they actually did code some of the people in Shida Kartli and Survey 2, I believe, more directly as saying, were they in a conflict zone versus a non-conflict zone? They didn't do that across both surveys. They didn't do that across both areas, though. So I just coded everyone there as being potentially affected by the conflict. But when I use that variable there, I get more precise and larger results. So that leads me confidence that, yeah, what I'm getting right now in the things I presented to y'all were a bit more, they're smaller than the actual effects in this case. So I think that's encouraging in that case. I totally agree with you on the covariate balance. I've gotten comments on that before. I need to keep working on those. And the Shida Kartli region. So there is a good reason behind that having a bigger effect. That's where most of the fighting took place. And most of the atrocities, most of the alleged massacres. Like, this was the area that had a lot more of a hotter, more opportunities for not just direct experiences, but stronger direct experiences. I think I could be more clear in how I'm defining direct and indirect along more spectrum, perhaps. Very strong direct experience, sort of a weaker indirect experience. And the Shida Kartli region experienced it, not just troops invading, that's the other region, Samagrelo also had that, but they also saw bullets flying and a much artillery firing and things like that at that rate. The city of Gori especially suffered a lot during that part of the conflict. So I think it makes theoretical sense that Shida Kartli has more there, but I need to do more when discussing the difference between indirect and direct there, the more of a spectrum in that, you know, artillery being fired and that sort of thing probably has a stronger effect than just seeing soldiers march past in that case. But yeah, great points.
Also, just a minor point, there is a paper by Bernd Weber and Alexander Skako and a co-author on riots in Khartoum in Sudan. And I mean, it's the dependent variable is whether people are supporting independence of South Sudan. But what's really interesting that made me think about your paper is that they also find that the people who suffer the violence more are more willing to concede. And somehow, like, this is kind of like, there's something about, well, you know, instead of like being more revengeful or like being more, I mean, people, or maybe there's something, this is unrelated to revenge, but it seems that people are more willing to, okay, I prefer to concede and to be safe, right? Than to not to concede and potentially have a conflict again. So maybe you wanted to take a look at that paper, even if again it's not a foreign policy paper, it's on domestic issues.
Thank you,
Jeff.
Yeah, so I had similar thoughts about kind of the language you used, you know, given the kind of level of aggregation of the survey, right? You talk about direct and indirect, but really what you're kind of coding is something closer to proximate versus distant. And I think that you know, besides the kind of general truth in advertising thing, you know, I think you're less likely to get pushback on the fact that, given the data that you have, it's really impossible for you to say whether or not individual respondents were directly affected or indirectly affected by the conflict. And I think that this maybe even, you kind of implicitly or you accidentally bring this point up when you talk about the kind of rockets, right, and the kind of airstrikes. And so the way your coding currently works is you have people coded, you almost certainly have individuals coded as being directly affected by the war who weren't directly affected, but you have people who are coded as being indirectly affected by the war that actually were directly affected by it if they suffered from the rocket attacks. And so I think the robustness checks, when you kind of recode the kind of rocket effect, that's really useful. And I think that some version of that should probably be your primary analysis. But I think just changing the language might kind of save you some heartache and kind of grief from reviewers.
Oh, Laia is talking, but we can't hear her.
I was just going to say that I completely agree, because I was very confused by this idea of like places that got airstrikes are not considered like a suffering directly from the conflict, and so it's just like, yeah, maybe like just more proximate or non-proximate would be just better. I mean, I think again that would be saving you a lot of headaches, given yeah, Jeff has said.
Yeah, the good news is that there is a pretty good number of data sources on where the airstrikes were. So I have a decent amount of data about where those were, who they affected. They were generally against airfields and communication centers, so they didn't affect the civilians as much directly as they would have the troops, say civilians who saw tanks roll past, for instance. Again, kind of on the spectrum effect there. But yes, I can do more, try to look more clearly at where those took place, maybe even the severity. I've tried to avoid getting into severity just out of how would I define severity necessarily of some of these proximity measures to the war. But it seems possible, and if that helps convince people, because I think you do see differences in severity at Chiego, for instance, where there's more, much more of fighting going on and direct experiences of not just seeing the enemy, but maybe suffering from that too. So I'll definitely look into ways, perhaps of, in addition to just showing areas that were affected like this, trying to get more precise in the way I'm looking sort of at the IV here in this case, what level of experience they would have had there.
Who's up next?
I have a comment.
Okay, go for it.
So this is kind of on another issue. So I was trying to think about how to frame the paper in a way that would make it especially attractive to reviewers and to the field and all that jazz. And one thing that you might, one way to frame it, I was thinking, which might be attractive, is to pull back a little bit from the interstate stuff. You still need the interstate theory, but pull back from the interstate frame and talk about, how, what is the conflict on political behavior / opinion. Okay. And there is a lot of very, in my opinion, a lot of very interesting work, including assumption conflicts, about how various kinds of youth experiences then affect political behavior and also political opinions and identity and everything else, right? You talk about some of them in the paper, the Zaitsev paper and so forth. There's some interesting emerging work on the effect of experiencing conflict on gender attitudes and so forth, right? And so, that might, so if you could frame it more directly to connect to that body of literature, then I think that would be more appealing to reviewers, just because that's where, the median voter in the conflict field is these days, is like sub-state conflict. Whereas framing it in kind of the interstate model of war, it's just not as complicated. And the good news is, I don't think it's that much. And especially because, as you noted, this is a big debate in counterinsurgency. What causes, how, does the experience of conflict affect the way people think about counterinsurgency? Some people think that one of the reasons the Afghanistan conflict has suffered for decades is because Afghanistan suffered so little during the 2000, or the Afghan people suffered so little during the 2000 war, interstate war. So anyway, so in terms of like making this a standalone, that might be something which might improve your likelihood of getting a favorable reception from like JCR reviewers. So anyway, I'll just kind of leave it there.
Yeah, thanks. You broke up a couple times during that, so I'm not quite sure I got everything from there, but I think I agree. I like the idea. Again, if it's a standalone paper, making it the more sub-state level thing. My dissertation's an interstate level thing, but I'm totally happy to, in this case, perhaps say this is more applicable to all conflict like this. And I like the counterinsurgency. I was not quite clear. I couldn't hear what you were saying about the specific case in Afghanistan there, but we could talk maybe afterwards about that.
I mean, just super briefly.
Yeah.
Some people propose that one of the reasons that violence, the occupation, the post-2001 occupation of Afghanistan has been difficult and violent is because the interstate phase in 2001 affected such a small proportion of the Afghanistan population. Okay. And so because they didn't actually experience the suffering, then they didn't, didn't see the need of accepting American occupation, right? And this is so Afghanistan in 2001 is like Germany in 1919, right? And it's not like Germany in 1945. And I actually have there's a paper a published paper that makes this argument. I'll send it your way, right? And so then the disturbing implication is, the bloodier the Civil War, the more widespread the suffering, then that has implications for what the post-Civil War phase looks like. And this gets into other interesting, debates within the Civil War literature of what causes people to be more willing to accept peacekeepers and what makes post-conflict democratization more likely, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I want to make sure I don't end up coming across as someone saying, you have to fight a war bloodily and terribly the whole time. But I think that there are trade-offs perhaps in the way that war can be conducted. And I think the Afghanistan case is a great one. I would love to see that paper on there to see how that works. And also, again, to see how maybe this interacts with other things after war, like other peacekeeping things and other ideas for reconciliation. The Russia-Georgia case is one where there hasn't been much reconciliation. They are still like a 45th round of talks about the status of the disputed regions. So there's not much progress being made in terms of peace at this point directly there. But I think this is a good way to frame it for within the landwork of both interstate and intrastate conflict too.
Yeah, so shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I found myself thinking when reading your results, and especially from the kind of second survey, is that it occurred to me that there might have been a simpler or maybe more parsimonious explanation for this, and that is that, or maybe just an alternative explanation, that what people are learning about is not the relative capabilities of Georgia and Russia, because it's, as it was pointed out, I don't think anyone thought that they were, pretty close to being equal. But instead, you're just kind of picking up on the kind of localized effects of conflict, or kind of the localized cost of war. And so, it's individuals in the areas that actually suffered war who then want to do things that are going to make a recurring war or, follow-up war less likely. And so you cite some of the relevant research on this in the kind of front part of the paper or the front part of the chapter. And so I'm thinking in particular Scott Gartner's work. But I think that it occurred to me that that's maybe a more straightforward or intuitive explanation for some of these results versus the results being about kind of updating and learning about relative power.
Laia wants to go next, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with this last comment, and I'm wondering if maybe you can do some heterogeneous analysis effects, heterogeneous effects analysis. So maybe, because I'm thinking that like not everyone will react the same way, right, in this region. So maybe there are like a number of characteristics of individuals that make them more prone to become risk averse to conflict than others, right? So maybe if you can play a little bit with the variables that you have in the survey, and try to untangle like some of these heterogeneous effects. Like maybe, for instance, one example is that women usually are more risk averse, right? So maybe you can find different effects like across gender, like, and that could just also like tease out a little bit of like what the mechanisms behind these results. Is this something about, again, fear, or it's just like more like personal security considerations, other like not like necessarily like foreign policy considerations, right? So I know maybe play a little bit more with the data to try to get at some of these things, I would say.
Can I add on a comment?
Sure.
I would take Jeff's point and push it even further, or make a sharper critique. All right. So the way that the question is framed, I think, in the survey rather, is would you be willing to, reduce military spending to reallocate to social spending? Is that right?
Yes.
Well, if you're in an area that's been devastated by war, you probably need more social spending, right? Because you have to rebuild homes and schools and whatever. A possible explanation is this has zero to do with actual beliefs, and it's just that in affected regions, you have a higher marginal payoff for more social spending. And so, kind of building on Laia's point, it would be great if you could look at the survey and see if there are some other questions in which you could rule that out as a possible.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do with that. It might be tricky in some cases, but I think that yeah, I'll take a look at that again and see what I can do. I like that, and also looking at the heterogeneous effects. That's a great idea. I should have done that earlier. And looking at who has the biggest changes in the shifts of these beliefs on those questions. So I'll definitely look at those.
Great. It's about time for us to wrap up, unless anybody has anything very pressing that you want to talk about. Okay. Thank you all for taking the time to read this paper closely and give great and very helpful comments to Chris. I think that hopefully he has an idea of where to go next with this. And thank you, Chris, for sharing your work with us. If you have, if anyone's viewing that would like to check it out, Chris's paper is up on our website, the Online Peace Science Colloquium's website. And I'm sure he would love to receive emails from people who have comments on his presentation or his paper itself. And I'd like to invite everybody back for December 14th for the last OPSC of the semester, in which Denise Sill and Alyssa Perak are presenting on explaining the design and implementation of Civil War peace agreements. So with that, I'll thank you all for coming.
Thank you all so much.
Best of luck, Chris.
Thank you.
Good luck with
Nice
the regions.
project.